The drill stopped at 3,412 meters because the torque reading went flat, not because we hit anything hard. That was the first wrong detail. In planetary subsurface survey work, you do not get flat torque. You get rising resistance, sudden drops when you punch through a void, the long shuddering plateaus of a hard mineral seam. Flat is the signature of a calibration fault or a sheared bit. I logged the time for 17 station local, and pulled the rig up 2 meters to clear the cutter face, then ran the diagnostic sweep on the downhole assembly. The sweep came back clean. Bit intact. Mud weight nominal. Sensor stack reporting within tolerance. I ran it again. Clean. I am von Kessler, lead subsurface engineer on the Erebus 4 survey, contracted through the Outer Bureau's Resource Verification Program. My job is to confirm or deny the presence of exploitable mineral structures on dead worlds, planets whose biospheres collapsed long enough ago that the regulatory clock has expired and commercial access is permitted. Erebus 4 had been dead, according to the Bureau's geochronology, for somewhere between 40 and 60 million years. The atmosphere was a thin nitrogen-argon mix. The surface was basalt sheet and frozen carbonate. There was no liquid water anywhere on the planet, and there had not been for a very long time. I had been on station 4 months. The contract was scheduled for 6. I logged the flat torque, flagged the borehole for re-entry the following shift, and went back to the habitat to sleep. The habitat was a 4-module pressure assembly anchored to the northern edge of the survey grid. There were 3 of us, myself, Ira Mendel on geophysics, and Stennis on systems and life support. We had 2 rovers, 1 orbital relay, and a contractually mandated 40-day evacuation reserve. The work was slow, well-paid, and unromantic. I had taken it because the rotation was long and because long rotations meant I did not have to be home for the anniversary. My daughter would have been 9 that month. I had not corrected anyone who assumed I had no children. I slept 4 hours, drank coffee that tasted like the recycler, and went back to the rig at 9 o'clock. The borehole was warm. Not warm in any sense that would have meant anything on a living planet. Warm in the sense that the downhole thermocouple, which had read a steady -41°C for the entire drilling run, was now reading -38 and climbing by roughly 0.02 degrees per minute. I pulled the assembly to the surface and inspected it. The cutter face had a thin film of pale gray material on it, fine as talc. I scraped a sample into a sterile vial and ran it through the spectrometer in the rover. The spectrometer hung on the analysis for 9 minutes. That was longer than I had ever seen it hang. When the result came back, it listed the sample as indeterminate, closest match, structural ceramic, sintered, non-natural origin. I read that twice. Then I read it a 3rd time, because reading it again was easier than deciding what to do with it. Sintered ceramic. Non-natural origin. 3.4 kilometers below the surface of a planet that had been dead since before the first vertebrates climbed out of the ocean on Earth. I did not tell Mendel or Stennis. Not because I distrusted them, but because the protocol for an anomalous material identification required documentation before disclosure, and I am the kind of person who follows the protocol because the protocol is what separates engineering from storytelling. I logged the sample, sealed the vial, photographed the cutter face, and filed a Level 2 anomaly notice with the Bureau relay. Level 2 means warrants review, does not warrant suspension. I did not yet have grounds for a Level 3. The Bureau acknowledged the filing 19 minutes later. The acknowledgement was automated. I went back to the borehole and lowered a passive listening sonde to depth. The sonde is a simple instrument, a hydrophone in a pressure housing, a thermocouple, and an inclinometer. We use it for monitoring borehole stability during shut-in periods. I left it down for the full 8-hour shift and went to help Mendel calibrate the magnetometer array on the eastern grid. Mendel asked me what was wrong. I told her the rig had thrown a torque fault and I was running diagnostics. She accepted this. Mendel is not curious about other people's work, which is one of the reasons we get along. At 1742, I retrieved the sonde data and ran the audio through the analysis suite. There was a sound at depth. It was not loud. It was not continuous. It occurred at intervals of approximately 14 minutes and 20 seconds, plus or minus 6 seconds, and it consisted of a low compound pulse, 2 closely spaced impacts followed by a longer trailing vibration. The frequency profile was consistent with a mechanical impact in a confined space. The interval was consistent with a regulated process. I sat in the rover for a long time looking at the waveform. A regulated process implies a regulator. A regulator implies an operator, or a machine, or a system that has been left running. None of those things were supposed to exist on Erebus 4. I considered briefly the possibility that the sound was an artifact of the borehole itself, thermal stress in the casing, mud settling, gas migration from a pressurized pocket. The interval ruled out thermal stress. Thermal stress is not regular. The waveform ruled out mud settling. Mud settling is not impulsive. Gas migration would have produced a continuous hiss, not a paired knock. I filed a Level 3 anomaly notice. Level 3 means warrant suspension pending review. Under the contract, filing a Level 3 required me to cease drilling operations within 12 hours and await Bureau guidance. The Bureau's response came at 22:11. It said, "Continue scheduled operations. Anomaly under review. Do not file additional notices on this matter without supervisor authorization." I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time. Then I sat in the rover with the heater clicking and tried to understand what I had just been told. There is no provision in the Bureau's anomaly protocol for suppressing a Level 3. A Level 3 either escalates to suspension or is downgraded with documented justification. There is no third option. What I had received was not a procedural response. It was an instruction issued by a human being who did not want to follow procedure. I went to bed. I did not sleep. In the morning I drilled. I drilled because the contract said I had to, and because refusing would have terminated my pay and my evacuation guarantee, and because some part of me, the part one do not like to look at directly, wanted to know what was down there. I drilled past 3,412 meters, through the layer that had given me the flat torque, and into something that the rig logged as void, partial fill, dense particulate suspension. I drilled another 60 meters and the bit came up coated again, more heavily this time, the same pale gray film, finer than dust. I did not file a notice. I logged the data, scraped a second sample, and sent it through the spectrometer. This time the spectrometer did not hang. It returned a match in 11 seconds. The match was structural ceramic, sintered, non-natural origin. Material consistent with previous sample VK001. Trace inclusions detected: nickel, iron, carbon in graphitic form, and a 4th element flagged as outside reference library. A 4th element outside the reference library. The reference library on the rover spectrometer contained every element and common isotope catalogued by the Bureau, the Outer Survey, and the 3 major academic consortia. There is no 4th element outside that library that is naturally occurring under normal stellar nucleosynthesis. There are heavier transuranics that decay in microseconds. There are theoretical island of stability isotopes that have been proposed but never observed. I ran the sample twice more. Same result. The instrument was not malfunctioning. It was telling me, in its limited vocabulary, that the material contained something it could not name. I sat with that for a long time. Then I did something I had not done in 11 months. I opened the personal locker beside my bunk and took out the small flat case that held my daughter's last cardiogram. I do not know why I keep it. I am not sentimental about objects. But I had carried it with me through 3 rotations and 2 reassignments, and I took it out now and looked at it because I needed to remember what evidence looked like when it referred to something real. The cardiogram was a piece of paper with a printed waveform on it. The waveform showed a heart that had been failing for some time before anyone noticed. The waveform was evidence. It described a system that had been doing the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, quietly for months, while the people responsible for noticing had been looking at other instruments. I put the cardiogram back in the case and the case back in the locker and went to find Mendel. Mendel was in the geophysics module, running a passive seismic correlation on the previous week's data. I asked her without preamble whether the array had picked up anything periodic at depth in the last 72 hours. She looked at me for a moment and then turned to her screen and ran a query. There was something periodic. She had not noticed it because it was below the threshold she normally filtered for, and because it was at a frequency that she did not consider geologically meaningful. When she pulled it up and stripped the filter, the signal was clear, a paired impact at intervals of 14 minutes and 20 seconds, plus or minus 6 seconds, propagating through the basalt sheet from a source somewhere south-southwest of the habitat. South-southwest of the habitat was the direction of my borehole. How long has it been doing that? I said. Mendel ran the query back through the archive. The signal was present in the first week of survey data. It was present in the first day. It had been present in the calibration recordings we had made before the habitat was fully pressurized. It had been there the entire time we had been on the planet. I asked her if she would run the same query on the archived survey data from the previous contract. The previous contract had been a 6-month survey conducted 4 years earlier by a different team. The data was in the habitat's reference archive. She ran it. The signal was in that data too. Same interval. Same waveform. We sat in the geophysics module and did not speak for a while. The heater clicked. The recycler hummed. Outside, the wind moved across the basalt sheet at a steady 12 meters per second, as it had every day since I arrived. I'm going to file a level 4, I said. Mendel said, they'll deny it. They already denied a level 3. She looked at me. Von. I know. A level 4 is the highest anomaly classification in the Bureau's framework. It triggers automatic evacuation and a planetary quarantine review. It cannot, in theory, be denied. In practice, I had never heard of one being filed, and I did not know what would happen when I filed it. I filed it from the geophysics module, with Mendel as witness. I attached the sample analyses, the sound audio, the seismic correlation, and the archive comparison. I logged the filing time at 11:47 station local. The Bureau acknowledged the filing 22 minutes later. The acknowledgement was not automated. It said, "Filing received. Hold position. Do not communicate findings externally. A supervisor will contact you within 6 hours. Maintain habitat protocols. Do not approach the borehole." I read that last sentence twice. Do not approach the borehole. The borehole was 40 meters from the habitat. I had been approaching it twice a day for 4 months. It was not a thing that could be avoided, in any practical sense, while remaining on station. I told Mendel what the message said. She nodded slowly and went back to her console and began, without being asked, to archive every piece of survey data we had generated to a redundant local drive. I went to find Stennis. Stennis was in the life support module, replacing a humidity sensor. I told him there was a situation. He set down his tool and listened. Stennis is the kind of person who listens without interrupting, which I have learned, over the course of 3 rotations together, is a more valuable quality in a colleague than almost any technical skill. When I finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" "I need to know if the habitat systems are showing anything unusual." "Unusual how?" "Anything. Any reading that doesn't match what you'd expect." He thought for a moment. The CO2 scrubber's been running about 4% above baseline for the last week. I assumed it was a filter loading issue. I have a replacement scheduled for tomorrow. 4% above baseline for one of us, or for the habitat? For the habitat. 4% above baseline meant the scrubber was working harder than it should have been to maintain atmospheric CO2 levels. The scrubber load is a function of how many people are breathing in the habitat, plus a small constant for ambient leakage and metabolic load from the recycler bacteria. There were 3 of us. The scrubber was working as if there were 3.1. It was not a large discrepancy. It was within the noise margin of the instrument. On any other day, I would have agreed with Stennis that it was a filter issue. "Run a leak check on the seals," I said. "All of them. And pull the recycler logs." He nodded and did not ask why. I went outside. I did not approach the borehole. I walked along the northern edge of the survey grid, where the magnetometer array was anchored to the basalt. The wind was steady. The sky was the pale rust color it was every afternoon, with the small white disk of the sun about 30 degrees above the horizon. The habitat was a low cluster of modules behind me, and the rig was a vertical line in the southern distance. I walked for about 20 minutes. I was looking for nothing in particular. I was trying to think. What I noticed, eventually, was the basalt. The basalt sheet on Erebus 4 is a flood basalt field, roughly 80,000 square kilometers, laid down in a single eruption event approximately 112 million years ago. It is featureless to the eye, a flat, dark, slightly glassy surface, fractured into rough polygons by cooling stress. The polygons are typically 2 to 4 meters across. In the area I was walking, the polygons were smaller. They were perhaps 30 centimeters across, and they were not rough. They were regular. The fractures between them were straight, and they intersected at angles that were close to, but not exactly 60 degrees. I knelt down and looked closely. The fractures were not fractures. They were grooves. They had been cut into the basalt, or formed in it, at a depth of perhaps 2 millimeters. They were continuous over a distance I could not see the end of. I stood up and looked around. The pattern extended in every direction. I had been walking across it for 20 minutes without noticing, because the grooves were shallow and because the basalt was dark and because I had not been looking for them. I walked back to the habitat and pulled up the orbital imagery on the geophysics console. The orbital imagery had a resolution of 50 centimeters per pixel. At that resolution, the grooves were invisible. I asked Mendel if there was higher resolution imagery available. She said there was, from the original survey 4 years earlier, archived but not indexed because it had been superseded. She pulled it up. 10 centimeters per pixel. The grooves were visible. They covered the entire northern half of the survey grid. They extended south past the rig, and beyond the imagery's coverage. The pattern was not random. It was tiled. The tiles were not identical, but they were related, variations on a small set of base patterns, like the script of a language with a small alphabet and a large vocabulary. Mendel said, "Why didn't we see this?" Because we weren't looking down. We were looking down. That's the whole job. We were looking for ore bodies. We were looking through the basalt. We weren't looking at it. She did not respond. I went back to the geophysics console and pulled up the archive imagery from the previous contract. The grooves were there too. Same pattern. Same tiling. I pulled up the imagery from the contract before that. 8 years earlier, a different team, a different rig. The grooves were there. But the tiling was different. Not by much. A few of the patterns had been replaced by other patterns. The grooves themselves were in the same places, but the variations within them had shifted. I sat back in the chair. The pattern was being edited. Slowly. Over years. Underneath us. While we surveyed. I did not understand what I was looking at, but I understood with a clarity I had not felt since the morning I had been called to the hospital, that I was not the first person to see it, and that whoever had seen it before had decided not to tell me. The supervisor contact came at 17:23, 11 minutes past the 6-hour window. The supervisor's name was Aldous Vorn. I had spoken with him twice before, both times about routine contract matters. He was a careful man with a flat voice. He came through on the encrypted channel and asked me, without greeting, to confirm that I was alone in the room. I told him I was. Mendel had stepped out at my request. "Mr. Kessler," he said, "I want to be direct with you. The findings you have reported are known to the Bureau. They have been known for some time. The protocol you followed was the correct one. The response you received was also correct, within a framework you do not have full visibility into." I waited. The site you are working on is one of a number of similar sites under long-term observation. Your contract permits subsurface survey to a depth of 4,000 meters. You have not exceeded that depth. You will not exceed that depth. You will complete the contract on schedule, you will be paid in full, and you will sign a supplementary non-disclosure agreement before departure. Do you understand what I am telling you? You're telling me to finish the survey and not ask questions. I am telling you that the questions you have are being addressed by people whose job it is to address them. Your job is to complete the contract. There is a structure under this planet. I am aware of what is under this planet. How long has the Bureau known? There was a pause. Long enough that I thought the channel had dropped. Then he said, "Longer than you have been employed by us." I said nothing. "Mr. Kessler, I am going to tell you something that is not, strictly speaking, within my authority to tell you. I am telling you because in my experience, engineers who are not told something will eventually find it out, and the finding out is usually worse than the telling. Do you want to hear it?" I said yes. The site is not dead. The planet is. The site is not. The site predates the planet's death by an interval we have not been able to determine. The site is, as far as we can establish, functioning correctly. We do not know what it is for. We have determined that interference with its operation produces results we are not prepared to accept. Your survey work is permitted because it does not interfere. It is, in fact, expected. Surveys like yours have been conducted at sites like this one for longer than the Bureau has existed under its current name. Do you understand? You're using us. We are observing. You are part of what we observe. For what? That is not a question I can answer. It is not a question anyone I report to can answer. The honest response is that we do not know what the site is doing, but we have learned that it does it more efficiently when surveyed. Your presence is a variable. The variable produces measurable effects. The effects are catalogued. The catalog is reviewed. That is the extent of what I can tell you. I sat with the channel open for a long moment. What happens if I leave early? I said. Nothing happens to you. Your contract is voided. Your bond is forfeit. You will not be hired again by any affiliated agency. The survey will be completed by someone else. What happens to the site? The site continues. The site has continued through 143 documented surveys. It will continue through this one. And the variable? The variable adjusts. I closed the channel. I sat in the geophysics module for some time after that. The heater clicked. Outside, the wind moved across the basalt sheet at a steady 12 meters per second. I thought about my daughter. I thought about her because the conversation I had just had was the same conversation, in structure, that I had had with the cardiologist 11 months earlier. The cardiologist had told me that the condition had been visible in earlier scans, that it had been catalogued, that the catalog had been reviewed, that the review had concluded no intervention was indicated, because intervention at that stage produced results the institution was not prepared to accept. He had used different words. The words had carried the same shape. I had not known until that moment in the geophysics module that I had been carrying the shape of that conversation around with me, looking for a place to set it down. I went to find Mendel. She was in the Habitat Common Space, drinking tea. I sat down across from her. I told her what Vorn had said. I told her all of it. I told her because the supplementary non-disclosure had not yet been signed, and because once it was signed I would not be able to tell anyone, and because Mendel was the only person on the planet, and possibly one of very few in any place, who had seen what I had seen and would believe me. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. There are two options." "I know. One is you finish the contract and sign the agreement and go home." "I know. The other is you go down there." I did not respond. "I'm not telling you to," she said. "I'm telling you those are the options. The third option, which is to file something with a regulator, doesn't exist. You know that." "I know. If you go down there, I'll cover for you on the logs. I can give you about 6 hours before Stennis notices the rover is gone. After that I can't help you." "Why would you do that?" She looked at her tea. She was a private person. I had worked with her for 3 rotations and I did not know whether she had family, or where she had grown up, or what she did between contracts. She had never told me, and I had never asked. "Because I had a brother," she said. "And the institution that was responsible for him told me, after he died, that the situation had been catalogued. That the catalog had been reviewed. I have been waiting 11 years to hear someone else describe that conversation." We sat for a while. "I'm not asking you to go," she said. "I'm telling you what I can do if you decide to." I went back to my bunk. I did not sleep. I took the cardiogram out of the locker and looked at it for a long time. The waveform was the same as it had been every other time I had looked at it. A heart that had been failing quietly, while the instruments that should have been watching it were watching something else. At 3 o'clock, I got up and dressed in the heavy environment suit. I loaded the rover with a deep descent harness, a portable spectrometer, a handheld seismic sensor, 3 days of oxygen, and a sample kit. I did not load a weapon. There was no weapon in the habitat to load. I drove to the rig. The borehole was at 3,472 meters by the previous shift's log. The casing was intact. The mud was stable. I rigged the deep descent harness, a powered cable system designed for inspection runs in deep boreholes, rated for human descent to 4,000 meters under controlled conditions. I had used it twice before in my career. Both times had been routine. This was not routine. I lowered myself into the borehole at 4:11. The descent took 86 minutes. The harness held. The borehole walls were smooth, cased above 2,000 meters and open below, the basalt giving way to a paler, denser rock I did not recognize. At 3,000 meters the temperature began to rise, not sharply, but steadily, from -38 to -12 over the last 400 meters. By the time I reached the bottom of the bore, the suit's external sensors read positive 4 Celsius. The bottom of the bore was not the bottom. The drill had broken through into a void. The void was not large, perhaps 3 meters in vertical extent, and it was floored 2 meters below the break by a smooth surface. The surface was the pale gray of the samples I had pulled. It was not flat. It curved away in a long, shallow arc, like the inside of an enormous shell. I disengaged from the harness and stood on the surface. The surface was warm through the suit. The air around me, the void was pressurized, at roughly 200 millibars, with a composition my suit could not fully parse, was warmer still. The seismic sensor in my hand registered the paired impact almost immediately. 14 minutes and 20 seconds later, it registered it again. The impact came from below me and from every direction, propagating through the curved surface like the sound of a bell struck somewhere very far away inside its own metal. I walked. The void extended further than my helmet light could reach. The ceiling above me was the broken rock of the bore's terminus, irregular and natural. The floor was curved and continuous, and made of the material the spectrometer could not name. There were no features on the floor for the first 60 or 70 meters. Then there were. The features were grooves. They were the same grooves I had seen on the surface. Same depth. Same angle. Same tiling. They covered the floor of the void in the same pattern, with the same small variations. The pattern on the surface was a copy. Or the pattern below was a copy of the surface. Or, and this was the thought that stopped me walking, they were the same pattern, expressed at 2 scales, in 2 materials, 80,000 square kilometers across and 3.5 kilometers apart, and the relationship between them was not coincidence. I knelt down and ran a gloved hand across the grooves. They were warm. They were not uniformly warm. Some of the grooves were warmer than others, and the warmer ones formed, when I traced them, a continuous line that ran away into the dark. I followed the line. I followed it for perhaps 300 meters before I came to the first of the others. The others were not bodies. I want to be precise about this. They were not bodies in any sense I had a word for. They were shapes, set into the floor of the void, partly embedded in the pale gray material and partly raised from it, of roughly human proportions but not human geometry. They were arranged in a long row along the warm groove, evenly spaced, perhaps 2 meters apart. There were at least 40 of them in the section my light could reach. I did not count past 40. They were not moving. They were not, as far as I could tell, alive in any operative sense. But the spectrometer, when I held it against one of them, returned the same indeterminate result I had gotten from the bit samples, with the same fourth element flagged as outside the reference library. They were made of the same material as the floor. They were made of the same material as the grooves. They were made of the same material as the structure I was standing inside, which extended, I now understood, under the entire basalt sheet, and possibly under the entire planet. I sat down on the warm floor. I sat down because my legs would not continue, and because some part of my mind that had been holding the situation at a procedural distance was no longer able to do so. The shapes in the floor were not human, but they were the size of humans. They were the size of someone who had been a human, and had been laid down, and had been incorporated, into the surface of a thing that was building itself slowly, in a pattern that propagated upward through 3.5 kilometers of rock, and emerged at the surface as a script no one had thought to read. 143 documented surveys. Vaughan had said. Each survey had brought engineers. Each engineer had walked across the grooves on the surface. Each engineer had drilled and pulled samples, and looked at instruments, and gone home, and signed an agreement, and not been hired again if they asked questions. I did not know what the shapes had been before they were shapes. I did not know whether they had walked here on their own, or been brought, or been made out of something else entirely. I did not know whether the warmth in the grooves was the residue of their being made, or the process of their being made, or something else that I had no framework for. I knew that the site was functioning correctly. Vaughan had said that too. Functioning correctly for a purpose the Bureau did not know. I sat on the floor for some time. The paired impact came and went, every 14 minutes and 20 seconds, plus or minus 6 seconds, somewhere below me. Then I stood up and walked back to the harness. I did not take a sample of the shapes. I do not have a clear reason for this. I had a sample kit. I had been trained to take samples. I did not take one. The clearest way I can put it is that I understood in a way I could not articulate that taking a sample would be participating, and that I had already participated enough. I ascended at 6:47. The ascent took 91 minutes. I logged the descent in the rig's local log as a deep inspection run, equipment integrity verified, no anomalies. I drove the rover back to the habitat. Mendel met me at the airlock. She did not ask what I had seen. She looked at my face and she did not ask. Stennis had not noticed the rover was gone. The CO2 scrubber was still running at 4% above baseline. The supplementary non-disclosure agreement arrived in my queue at 9 o'clock. It was 19 pages. I read it carefully. It did not mention the site. It did not mention the structure. It described, in the careful language of contract law, a category of observation that the signatory agreed not to discuss with any unauthorized party, in perpetuity, under penalty of civil and criminal liability, the specifics of which were referenced but not enumerated. I signed it. I signed it at 11:14 station local, on the 5th of the month, and I will tell you why. I signed it because I had two options, and the other option was to refuse, and to forfeit the bond, and to be removed from the planet without the agreement, which meant I would not be subject to its restrictions, which meant I would be free to tell anyone what I had seen. And what I had seen was that the site had been continuing through 143 surveys. And what I had concluded, sitting on the warm floor of the void, was that the site continued because the surveys continued. That the surveying was part of the process. That the engineers who walked across the grooves and drilled into the structure and went home and signed and did not speak were not contaminating the site. They were feeding it. The variable adjusted, Vaughan had said. The site does it more efficiently when surveyed. If I refused the agreement, I would be removed. The contract would be completed by someone else. That someone would walk across the grooves, and drill and pull samples, and go home and sign and not speak. The site would continue. My refusal would change nothing about the site. It would only change whether the next engineer was me or someone else. But if I refused the agreement and went public, if I broadcast everything I had seen on every channel I could reach before the Bureau silenced me, then the site would be known. It would be known to people who would come and look at it. People who would come and look at it would be, by the site's own logic, a new survey. A larger survey. A survey at a scale the structure had not yet been fed. I did not know what the structure was building. I did not know what the shapes in the floor had been. I did not know whether bringing more attention to the site would accelerate it, or starve it, or do nothing at all. I did not know. What I knew was that the cardiologist, 11 months ago, had told me that intervention at a late stage produced results the institution was not prepared to accept. I had not believed him at the time. I had thought he was hiding behind procedure. I had hated him for it, with a clean and uncomplicated hatred, for almost a year. I understood him now. I understood him in a way I did not want to understand him. I understood that there are situations in which the institution is not lying when it says it does not know what intervention will do, and in which the honest thing, the procedurally correct thing, the engineering thing, is to admit that you do not know, and to choose the action whose consequences you can at least partially bound. I could bound the consequences of signing. I could not bound the consequences of speaking. I signed. The remaining 6 weeks of the contract passed in a way I will not describe in detail, because the detail is not interesting. I drilled. I pulled samples. I logged data. The data was filed with the Bureau and, I assume, added to the catalog. The catalog was reviewed. I do not know by whom. Mendel and I did not discuss what I had seen. We did not need to. She watched me for the first week, and then she stopped watching me, because there was nothing to see. I was operationally normal. I did my job. I ate my meals. I slept when I was supposed to sleep. The CO2 scrubber returned to baseline after Stennis replaced the filter, and I do not know whether it had ever been registering what I thought it was registering, and I have chosen not to think about it further. The paired impact continued, every 14 minutes and 20 seconds, in the seismic data, all the way until the end of the contract. Mendel filtered it out of her reports. I did not ask her to. She did it on her own. We were extracted on the 43rd day of the second quarter. The extraction vehicle landed at the eastern pad and we boarded with our personal effects and the certified data packages and nothing else. I looked at the basalt sheet one last time from the window of the shuttle. From 300 meters up, the grooves were invisible. From 1,000 meters up, the survey grid was a small bright rectangle on a dark plane. From orbit, the planet was the color of old iron, and there was no sign of anything at all. I have been back on Earth for 14 months. I have not taken another contract. The Bureau has offered me 3. I have declined all of them. They have not pressed. I do not think they expected me to accept. I think they understand, in a way that is part of their own catalog, what happens to engineers who have signed the supplementary agreement and walked back through the same door they walked in. I live in a small apartment in a coastal city whose name I will not give. I work as a consultant on terrestrial drilling projects, none of which involve the Bureau or any affiliated agency. I am paid less than I was paid on Erebus for. I am paid enough. I do not sleep well. This is not new. I did not sleep well before the contract either, for reasons that predate the contract by years. What is new is that I have begun to notice patterns. I notice them on sidewalks, in the joins between paving stones. I notice them in the tile work of older buildings. I notice them in the cracks and dried mud at the edge of the harbor, and in the arrangement of leaves on certain trees, and in the spacing of windows on a particular block of office buildings near my apartment. The patterns are not the same as the patterns on Erebus 4. They are not, as far as I can determine, related in any structural way. They are simply patterns. They are everywhere. They have always been everywhere. I had never looked at them before because I had not been trained to look at them, and because looking at them is not, in any practical sense, part of being alive on Earth. I do not think the patterns mean anything. I want to be clear about that. I do not think Earth has a structure beneath it that is being slowly built. I do not think the cracks in the harbor mud are a script. I have considered these possibilities and I have rejected them, on the evidence available, with the same procedural discipline I have applied to every problem in my career. What has changed is not the patterns. The patterns were always there. What has changed is that I cannot stop seeing them. I cannot stop seeing them because once you have understood that a thing can be a regulated process, you cannot ununderstand it. You cannot return to the prior state in which the world is divided cleanly between the things that have purposes and the things that do not. You carry, after Erebus 4, a permanent uncertainty about which side of that line any given pattern falls on. You carry it the way you carry a piece of paper with a waveform on it, in a flat case in a locker beside your bunk, because it is evidence of something you cannot put down. I keep the cardiogram in a drawer in the kitchen now. I take it out sometimes and look at it. I do not look at it because it makes me feel close to my daughter, which it does not. I look at it because it is the only piece of physical evidence I have in this apartment of a system that did the wrong thing for the wrong reasons while the instruments that should have been watching it were watching something else. I look at it to remind myself that I have seen this before, that the structure of the experience is not new, that what happened on Erebus 4 was not an anomaly in my life, but a clarification of something my life had already been doing. The Bureau sends me a brief notice every 6 months. The notice confirms that my agreement remains in force, that my bond is being held against future compliance, and that I am authorized to contact a specified case officer if I experience any psychological irregularities related to the contracted observation. I have not contacted the case officer. I do not consider what I am experiencing to be irregular. I consider it to be the correct response to what I saw, expressed at the only scale a single person can express it on, which is the scale of an individual life lived more quietly than it was lived before. The site continues. I know it continues because the catalog continues, and because the catalog could not continue without input, and because the Bureau has not stopped sending engineers. I do not know what survey is happening on Erebus 4 right now. I do not know whose torque reading is going flat at 3,412 meters. I do not know whether they have noticed the grooves yet, or whether they will, or whether the noticing is itself part of what the structure requires. I think about this most evenings. Not as a torment. As a fact. The way a person who has worked in a particular industry thinks about the industry after they have left it. With knowledge, and with the particular kind of helplessness that knowledge produces when it cannot be acted on. I am told by the few people I have allowed close enough to tell me anything, that I am quieter than I used to be. I do not know whether this is true. I do not have a reliable internal baseline against which to measure it. What I know is that I am careful now about what I look at. I do not look at the harbor for too long. I do not walk past the office buildings near my apartment unless I have a reason to. I keep my eyes on the middle distance, where the patterns are too coarse to read. The paired impact, 14 minutes and 20 seconds apart, is not something I can hear here. The atmosphere is wrong. The substrate is wrong. The distance is too great. But I check my watch sometimes, without meaning to, at intervals of approximately 14 minutes. I have caught myself doing it. I have caught myself doing it more than once. I do not know whether this is a habit I developed on Erebus 4 and brought home with me, or whether it is something else. I have decided not to investigate further. There are some investigations a person can complete, and there are some that complete the person. The cardiogram is in the drawer. The agreement is in force. The site continues. I continue. That is the report.